Using your computer audio. Janine, I'm confirming that it's 12 o'clock somewhere in New York, and so we'll go ahead and get started.
Fantastic.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Again, I am Betsy Worley. I'm the Encore Network lead, and I'm delighted to welcome so many Encore colleagues to our webinar on reframing aging. Today's webinar is one that we're offering to many colleagues who connect with Encore in different programs. And so it's exciting to offer a topic of such interest across all of our work. I especially want to give a shout out to colleagues from Australia, Canada, France, and Italy. So you are making this discussion worldwide in addition to our coverage across the United States. Encore is planning future webinars on other big topics, so we will be in touch as those get scheduled, and look forward to having you join us and adding great content that supports your work. Today's format for our conversation, all of you will be on mute to save everyone's sanity and ensure great quality for our webinar. We invite you to type questions into the chat box. For those not completely familiar with Zoom, just hold your cursor over the bottom of your screen. You will see a chat box. Janine will stop and ask for questions. I will read them. So whenever the mood strikes you, type them in and we will cover them. Finally, after today's session, we'll send the recording, we'll send the presentation, and in the near future, Janine will recap all of the questions and answers so that all of us have those handy. All right, now for the fun part. I am pleased to introduce Janine Vanderburg. In connection with today's webinar, Janine is a certified Frameworks Institute master trainer for their Reframing Aging program. Last year, I am sure that Janine is by far the super trainer of the whole Reframing Aging program. Last year, she facilitated 42 workshops that reached over 1,300 people. So Janine is extremely immersed in this subject. And Reframing Aging is at the heart of Janine's work that she's been doing for many years. She is lead strategist and trainer for a truly impressive program, Changing the Narrative in Colorado. That's a campaign to change the way people walking around in our communities think, talk, and act about aging, older people, and ageism. Janine will give you a link to the Changing the Narrative website, and I really encourage you to look at what that work on social media, and how a very broad strokes effort to combat ageism. Janine is also the founder of the Colorado Encore Network. She is a member of the Encore Network leadership team, and she's CEO of Encore Roadmap, which provides inspiration and tools for capitalizing on the strengths and talents of older adults. And Janine works in many different dimensions. As a resident of Denver, she was a member of the Denver Commission on Aging, and last year received the Mayor's Diversity and Inclusion Award for her advocacy on behalf of older adults. So we are privileged to hear from Janine today and really look forward to your overview of Reframing Aging, Janine. Thanks very much for leading our program.
Okay, Betsy, terrific. And thanks to all of you. I'm so excited to do this. So we are going to go ahead and dive right in. Reframing Aging is one of the things that we do at Changing the Narrative in Colorado, which is funded in Colorado by both Rose Community Foundation and Next 50 Initiative. So I want to thank our sponsors. So since this is called Introduction to Reframing Aging, we're going to start with what is reframing. And okay, here we go. What is reframing? So I like to think of reframing in context of that story, of that sort of ancient parable about the blind man and the elephant. And everyone is seeing one piece of the elephant, whether it's the trunk or the body, the legs. And everyone is seeing it from their perspective based on their own experience. Framing and reframing is basically a set of choices of how we communicate, the words that we choose to use so that people can better understand a social issue. So in this case, so that people can see, we can widen the lens and people can see the entire elephant, if you will, as opposed to just one part. An example I've been using lately, and I'll just ask you to think, if I say the word patriot, just jot down kind of what you think. And for some people, when I used this recently in a workshop, some people said, well, New England, Tom Brady, they might have another story today. Some people said veterans. Some people talked about founding fathers and what that meant. Some people talked about homeland security. Essentially, we all have cultural models in our minds that are derived from our experiences that sometimes limit our ability to see a larger picture. So reframing is basically a set of choices of how we communicate so that people better understand, if you will, a social issue. In this case, so that people better understand aging, they better understand older people, and they better understand ageism. So why is this important to do? Well, essentially what we know, and the US Census Bureau released this graphic about a year ago. And we see that in 1960, what a population pyramid looked like, right? At the bottom of the pyramid, we have lots and lots of younger people, and we taper to a very small number of older people. The projections in the United States for 2060 are that we're going to column shape, that the distribution of population is pretty much the same, younger, older. And this is important to understand because a common term that we've seen in the United States is talking about the silver tsunami of baby boomers. And somehow once all of these baby boomers, of which I am a part, once we all just die off, well, you know, we're not going to have to talk about this aging problem anymore, and it will go away. Understanding the fundamental shift, the fundamental demographic shift that is going on in the United States and across the world, in both developed and developing countries, is really important to understanding of why we need to reframe aging. Because so many of our policies, our programs, and our systems are derived from a time when a population pyramid looked like it did on that left-hand side in 1960 and doesn't reflect this fundamental shift in demographics that is going on across the world. So we need to be able to talk differently and communicate what these changes are, why they require new ways of thinking, why they require innovation, and why we need to think about looking at things differently. We know that framing, and specifically the research-based frames that you're going to hear about today, we know that they build support for some of these innovative ideas like these, and some of these ideas that Encore has actually been at the forefront of. So we know that the tested frames increased support for the idea that public funding ought to be available to make it easier for people to stay in their own homes, to age in community. We know that it increased support for things like policies to allow people to take time away from their jobs to provide caregiving. And significantly, I think probably for the work that many of you do, it increased support for the idea that public funding ought to be available for programs that allow older people to contribute to their communities for things like gen-to-gen programs. So we know that framing can be really significant to shift public understanding about what they think about older people, what they perceive can be done, and how public policy can really make a difference as we undergo this fundamental demographic shift. So the frames that we're going to share with you today are based on research that was commissioned basically over a period of about 3 years by 8 leading aging organizations. So organizations like AARP and Gerontological Society of America and American Society on Aging. And what they did is they understood that the way they were communicating kind of wasn't getting across to the general public, and the kind of supports, the kind of public conversations that need to take place about what does it mean to live in a society where people are older. So they commissioned this organization called Frameworks Institute. It's a national communications and research firm that's based in DC, and they asked Frameworks to do basically 4 things. First, to look at what is the research saying, what do experts know about this fundamental demographic shift and what it is like to grow older. They also did an analysis of what is the media talking about, so looking at what media articles have said about aging and ageism in America. And I do want to clarify for our colleagues who are with us for other countries, this research it was done with a U.S. population. So can't vouch for the adaptability, but hoping that you get some, good ideas out of this anyway. A really significant thing that Frameworks did in part of their research was analyze how does the general public think. And this is important. This is not a public opinion survey, but it is deep qualitative interviews to map what are those cultural models that are in our minds that either make us receptive to messages like organizations like Encore or make us resist those messages. And they did it in analysis of key themes. And finally, and what we're going to share with you today, is what actually shifts public opinion in a positive direction about older people, about aging, about what we can do. What makes them more supportive of public investment? What makes them more supportive of programs like many of you do, whether it's Gen to Gen or Encore Networks, Encore Careers? And they did that through a combination of on-street interviews, experimental surveys, and I want all of you to jot this number down in case you get resistance when you were talking about this back in your own organization. The sample size was huge. It was over 12,000 people, and it was demographically representative of age, race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, and political affiliation. So pretty significant research. And I do this, and I say this along with a trigger warning. You may hear, as we're going through this webinar, some things that you may not agree with, and they may not resonate with you. And that may be because you yourselves are experts in this, and you may think, well, of course. You may think, well, of course, because you've been involved in the Encore movement. What is really important to understand is that the general public may not, and how they think about aging issues may be different than how you think of it as experts and people who have been immersed in the work, and that what the frames that you are hearing, the messages, the words that we will encourage you to use and not to use have been tested and helped increase public understanding of what all of these issues are about. So I'm going to ask you, all of you right now, to chat your ideas into Betsy. If I'm asking you, how do you think the public thinks about aging? Chat your ideas in. Let's just take 30 seconds, use that chat box, and then Betsy, I'll wait for you to summarize what people think.
Yeah. That it's a very unpleasant part of life. Thank you, Norman Reese, for being first off the blogs.
Okay.
From some other answers, disease, death, and dementia, it won't happen to me. Drain on the resources of younger people.
Oh my God, yeah.
I think people want to ignore the elderly. Aging is decline.
Mm-hmm. Lots
of ageist stereotypes. I think most people are not thinking at all about aging.
So all of you have obviously participated in a reframing aging workshop of some sort. So let's go ahead and find, basically what Frameworks did is they analyzed all of this qualitative input of how does the public think about aging. And they came up with these categories that they called the SWAMP. So as we go to this slide, and the swamp, I feel a need to say, is not a political term in any way. It is a metaphor that Frameworks uses to describe all of the things that are in our heads. So when we hear someone like any of you, like Encore.org, talk about aging and what older adults can do, our minds are kind of cluttered with the stuff in the swamp. So kudos to all of you who said the general public does view aging and getting older as a time of decline, depression, dependence. Somebody else came up with some other Ds. I think they said dementia, etc. And that is a predominant way of thinking of the general public. It is contrasted somewhat by this idealized version that I call the pharmaceutical ad version, that we are kind of, it's earned leisure, we are on the beach, life is lovely, but the predominant view of thinking is that getting older in America is a time of decline, depression, dependence, not being able to do things, not being productive any longer. I think one of you chatted in this idea of taking resources away from younger people, and a very strong theme of us versus them. So in the minds of the general public, older people are an other group. We are otherized. And it's us versus them. There's a lot of zero-sum thinking going on. So somehow, if we support programs like Encore programs, we are taking things away from younger people. A friend of mine I was having lunch with exhibited some of this, and I was shocked. She herself, former foundation program officer, she's in her 50s, very well educated, and said to me, you know, Janine, I love this thing that you're doing about ageism, but really if we stay in the workforce, aren't we taking jobs away from younger people? Now, the reality is that that's false, and there are 4 reputable studies, including one from the Stanford School of Economics, that show actually the longer older people stay in the workforce, the better off it is for the economy, obviously for government, continuing to pay taxes, but also for younger people, and it actually creates more opportunity. But that is not the predominant way of thinking. So there's a lot of us versus them going on. As we go in the middle, there's a very strong theme of individualism, that if somehow someone is not doing well as a result of getting older, it's their fault. They should have saved more money. Thus our lovely little piggy bank picture. They should have saved more money. They should have walked more. They should have exercised more. This was really brought home to me when a very strong aging advocate in Colorado talked about her own mother who's in her 80s, who's doing terrific. And she said, you know, if everybody were like mom, mom is walking every day and so doesn't have any of these ailments. We chatted a little bit further, and it turns out that mom lives right next to a walking trail that a community in Colorado built because they wanted everybody in their community of all ages to have access to a healthier lifestyle, to be able to walk daily. So it was actually a collective solution and not individualism. But we have a very, very strong theme of individualism that interferes with people thinking about how do we make public policy changes that would support programs like Encore programs. Next, we have a really strong theme of nostalgia and threat of modernity. Nostalgia sounds like this. Well, you know, in the good old days, the kids took care of grandma. In the good old days, we had pensions. In the good old days, Social Security was solvent. Betsy, I'm going to ask people to chat just very quickly something in again. What might be wrong with that good old days thinking? Can I ask if each of you to think about something and chat it into Betsy? I'll give you about 30 seconds.
Okay.
Okay. What are we?
Am I back?
You.
Great. Okay. Let's, the past wasn't really as rosy as many of us think. It had challenges too.
Right.
Older people had no voice.
Mm-hmm.
In those days, certain segments of society were discriminated against.
Right.
Poetically, living in the past is like driving while looking in the rearview mirror.
I love that. Thank you to whoever said that.
Yes, it was Donna Seward, and life expectancy was shorter.
Right. Yes. So yes and yes to all of this. So this whole nostalgic thinking, and whoever said driving while looking back, it's really hard to move forward and to advance some new thinking about what we need to do in light of this fundamental demographic change if we are looking in that rear view mirror. We know that life expectancies were much lower. We know that when Social Security was established with an age of 62, that the average life expectancy was just under age 60. So, and we also know that a lot of older people fared really, really badly. So when we are looking back, it makes it really hard to look forward. And this leads us to our final thing, that cultural model that is in the minds of the general public when they think about aging in America. And that's, how do people think about solutions? So when people are asked, well, what should we do about this fundamental demographic shift and aging in America? One thing that people default to is individual solutions. Well, everybody should just save more money. Probably a great idea to start encouraging people as they are younger to save money, and there's certainly a lot of campaigns about that, but not really helpful if someone is currently older, had savings wiped out in 2008 recession, or is in that category of older adults. And we know from recent research, it's over half of older adults age 50 and above pushed out or laid off. So individually solutions don't tend to work that well there. Also, a really strong theme of what we just need is more education and more resource sharing. Again, a good idea, but not sufficient in light of our general demographic shift. But the final and most troubling idea that the general public thinks about solutions is that there aren't any. And so, and don't consider things like the contribution that older adults can make, don't consider the work that many of you do, and they simply say that there's no solutions. And I like to call that's kind of like putting a blankie over your head kind of solution. So we really, our challenge as people who are working in this field and who want to communicate effectively, not only about our work, but more broadly about the movement, is we need to move people away from, quote, the swamp, and we need to move them towards more productive ways of thinking about aging, getting older in America, and what can be done that are more consistent with what experts know. It's important to note that there are two things that frameworks found are totally absent from thinking. So one was the idea that ageism exists. And so very important for all of us to, whenever we talk about ageism, to actually define it as prejudice, as stereotypes, as discrimination about people based on their age. Ageism can be directed against younger people. So if anyone is out there talking about entitled millennials, absolutely ageist, as well as older people. But generally, the general public doesn't understand that ageism is real and has really harmful effects for older people. The second thing that is really missing from public thinking is the idea that context matters, social determinants matter. For those of you who are in Gen to Gen and working with children and youth, probably having a lot of conversation about social determinants of health and how access to fresh food and education and so forth makes a difference. In the minds of the general public, though, the idea that there's also social determinants that can really make a difference in how older people thrive as they age and are able to age in community is generally missing. So we need to keep that in mind and make sure that when we are talking about our work, not just in terms of work with individuals, but how we are providing a context and social determinants for people to thrive better. So we're going to pause a moment again for just any questions that you have about what I've shared thus far. And Betsy?
I am standing by.
Standing by. We'll give you about 15 seconds. And if you don't have questions, you can simply go, no questions.
Will this webinar be available for replay? Yes, I'll take that one. Yes, it will. We'll also send the presentation. And Janine will recap the questions and answers.
Anything else?
A lot of people saying no questions.
Okay, fantastic. So we're going to move on. So what we need to do so that we can redirect people away from the swamp and make them better understand the value that older adults can bring, what the reality is of aging, how public policy can make a difference, how the kind of work that organizations involved with Encore, who are members of the Encore network, really make a difference, is we need to tell what is called by Frameworks Institute, an effective social issue narrative, or story, if you will. At one time, the idea for those of us who communicated it around any kind of social issues, let's just tell a story. And what we now know from research is that some stories actually just trigger really not productive thinking and drag people back in the swamp. So those are the kind of stories we want to avoid. And instead, we want to tell what is a social issue narrative. And a social issue narrative basically has three components that you see in front of you. The first is to lead with values, and I'm sure that many of you who have experienced this, if you are working on social issues and you go home for the holidays and you try to explain what you do, I'm sure that some of you, in the same way that I have many times in my life, people kind of pat you on the head and just say, oh, that's so lovely, you're doing good work. But the reality is that a lot of people don't understand our work and what it is. So, and neither does the general public. So it's really important to appeal to shared values. And the values that we're going to share in the stories are those that have been tested by Frameworks Institute and shown to shift public thinking in a positive direction. We basically lead our story by talking about values and explaining to people, why does this matter? The second part of the story is really coming up with an explanation. So we need to explain to people, how does this actually work? Go back to that image of the elephant. So they're not just seeing the leg of the elephant, they're seeing the whole elephant. And if something isn't working, we need to explain why not. And finally, because part of the swamp is that people think that nothing can be done about this fundamental demographic shift, and instead they tend to believe this silver tsunami thinking. Older people are just going to bankrupt the country, the world, etc. We need to provide them with solutions that are concrete, that are causal and credible. And to me, the good news and the exciting thing about doing this webinar for our Encore network, and I know from having done a version of this at Encore, all of you have amazing solutions to put forward. So for the rest of our webinar, I want you to think about the solutions and then kind of that you have and that you're putting forward, and work backwards and think, how do I layer them within this story? There were two social issue narratives that were tested that shifted public opinion. The first on the left-hand side is called Embracing the Dynamic, and it's basically going to the fact that we have this increased longevity. Americans, like the rest of the world, are living longer and for the most part healthier lives, and so we've got this fundamental demographic shift going on. And it's a function of two things. One, people are living longer lives, but also we have declining birth rates, not only in the United States, but around the world. So the combination of that is we've got a fundamental demographic shift. Embracing the dynamic is a way about talking about that shift and positioning it as an opportunity if we are innovative in our thinking. And again, loving to do this with Encore because you've been leading with innovation for the last 2 decades. The second is a way of talking about ageism. So remember first that most people don't know what ageism is. So we need to explain what ageism is. We need to explain that it is real. We need to explain that there are detrimental effects to it. And we need to talk about it in a way that helps people understand and want to do something about it. So those are the two stories we're going to be talking about: embracing the dynamic and confronting injustice. We're going to start with embracing the dynamic narrative. So here you have in front of you the completed narrative, and we're going to walk through each element. So first is to think about the value of ingenuity. So one of the things that Frameworks found is people like to think of ourselves as being innovative and being able to not only solve problems, but seizing opportunities. So the message that we want to communicate is, let's use that spirit of innovation to re-envision what aging looks like in the United States. I want each of you, we're not going to do kind of a chat on it right now, but just think of some of the things some of the innovations that have occurred in the last decade, things like sharing economy and Uber and Lyft, things like the evolving technology of smartphones. How can we use that kind of spirit of innovation and apply it to aging in the US? So that's what we lead with. We lead with the idea that this increased longevity is actually an opportunity for us. And what we've got to do is apply our spirit of innovation to think about what can we do with this increased longevity. And on the other side, also recognizing that people living longer, if we don't do anything, can pose some problems or challenges for our communities. So how do we get people to think about it in terms of how do we use innovation, right, to overcome these problems? So that's part one. That's what we lead with. The middle part of the story was deliberately selected, and the term building momentum is a metaphor. And building momentum was specifically geared to challenge that idea of decline, deterioration that you heard about in the swamp. I don't know if any of you are in the sort of 40 plus, 50 plus, 60 plus. I can't remember when I first got my "it's all going downhill" birthday card, but building momentum was specifically selected as a title for the metaphor to say, no, we're not going downhill, we're building momentum. Again, as we get older, we build momentum. We get new ideas. It powers us up to advance towards new goals. If we harness that, and so I know, Mark Friedman has talked for years about harvesting this experience dividend, it can power up our society and it moves our communities forward. So building momentum, to me, and what the research that Frameworks did is so aligned with everything that Encore has done about this kind of this buildup of experience. And I think it applies to us at any age. If any of you of any age think about what is one thing that you know today, right now, in this moment, that you didn't know a year ago, however painfully learned, that's acquired wisdom. And think of how we acquire that wisdom over time. So we can either sideline that wisdom because of ageism, or we can say, how do we build on that momentum and actually use it toward our communities? This is what I think that all of you involved to Gen will probably appreciate the most, and you may have heard this. If a concrete solution that actually tests very well are intergenerational community centers. So anything that talking about how older people and younger people move working together, we know that it benefits older people because it boosts older people's participation in our communities. And all of you involved in Gen work also know the research that shows has incredible benefits for younger people, children as well. So that's basically a really powerful story that has been demonstrated to increase public understanding of aging, increase public understanding of the contribution that older adults can make to community, and increase support for public policy and public investment. So a great, great way to talk about it. I'm now going to share with you an example of how thinking shifts after being exposed to a short statement about this story, about embracing the dynamic. When I click into the video, you're going to see about a 1-minute video, and I'm going to encourage you to look at the lower left-hand corner. There is a circle around it, and you will see before and after. So again, this is part of the Frameworks research. They talk to people on the street. They say, so what do you think about getting older? And people say, you're going to hear what they're going to say. Then they are exposed to this social issue story, and you'll see how their thinking changes.
What comes to mind when you think about getting older?
Trying not to get bummed out by other people that are old. I don't want to succumb to any mindset of old, because I see they talk about their ailments a lot. They talk about money problems. I love that because everybody contributes no matter how old they are. They need more opportunities because they can still have really good sharpened skills that they've always had. Because ideas can come to anybody, you know what I mean? You can be 80 years old and get a really good idea.
What comes to mind when you think about getting older?
It's a lot of work.
Okay.
I mean, joints start going, memory starts going. I don't know why they call it the golden years. You can't do the things you used to do. You now have the freedoms to go out and do some of the things that you've always wanted to do. we're going to experience new experiences that we've never done before.
Yeah. So what comes to mind when you think of getting older?
Take care of your health. Make sure you see them, go to them doctor's appointments, and you can't do as much when you get older. Getting older now it's kind of changed, like a bad thing now. The good thing about getting older, like you said, wisdom and learning. If we had some more community programs that helps that young people interacting with older people, it's a beautiful thing. You make me feel like, yeah, it's a beautiful thing to get older.
So some of you are probably thinking, what drug did they take before and after? And actually it was exposure to this idea about embracing the dynamic. And that's important because the stories or these social issue narratives that Frameworks puts forward, they first test with that sample size of over 12,000 people to see which actually shift public opinion in a positive direction, which actually decrease ageism, which increase public support for the kind of programs and the kind of policies that you all are advancing. And then they test them in real life to see, okay, if we are in a conversation with someone, does this actually work as well as it did in this large size experimental survey? So that's what you're seeing there is an example of the before and after. I want to now encourage you to just think about how I will be sending you basically a blank social issue narrative statement as kind of one of the handouts. And I want to just share with you a brief example of how quickly you can adapt it to your programs. So I've delivered, and I call this writing the Mad Lib style. So I've started, and I would encourage you to do this. We have a concrete solution in changing the narrative, and I will send you this as well. We are making the case to employers. We are doing a series of workshops to employers about the benefits of age-friendly and multi-generational workplaces. So we're doing a campaign about that. And we started with the concrete solutions that we want. So if you look on the right-hand side, that we want employers to adapt. We want them to adopt policies that encourage older adults to stay in the workforce, including offering flexible work arrangements and upskilling, that is ongoing training, because one of the things that we know is often employers will invest in younger workers but not in older workers. It's harder for older workers to stay in the workforce and be that kind of mentor if they're not getting both that flexibility and that upskilling. And of interest, and ought to be of interest to all employers, is that both younger workers and older workers are interested in both flexible work and upskilling. So then we go backwards, and here's how we layer it into the social issue narrative. Ingenuity. Let's use our spirit of innovation to reimagine what work looks like as Coloradans are living longer and healthier lives. Then we go to building momentum. As we get older, we build up experience, insight, and wisdom that can be invaluable to younger workers and startups. And additionally, companies that are experiencing workforce shortages that are hampering growth can benefit from hiring and retaining older workers. Then we go to what our concrete solutions are. So again, you'll be getting some blank ones, and I would encourage you to kind of just, spend some time, even with your team, mad-libbing, okay, how do we apply these concepts to our own? We're next going to look to the second narrative that worked, and this is really a social issue story about ageism. The reason, and what we are very deliberately calling it, is confronting injustice. One of the things that some of the national aging organizations were doing, we're talking about ageism as the next civil rights issue. And what happened with that was it kind of backfired for a number of reasons. One, it backfired because people who've experienced racism and sexism thought, well, it can't possibly be as bad. The other reason that it backfired was it limited people's thinking. The only way we can deal with ageism is by encouraging people to file lawsuits or complaints with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and it stopped people from thinking about kind of policy level solutions. So we are going to talk about ageism, and it is important to talk about ageism, but we're going to talk about it from a frame of confronting injustice. So why does it matter? We want to invoke the value of justice, and we want to say, even though this may not be a realized value in our country, it is absolutely an aspirational value, and that our society should treat older people as equals and ensure that they have meaningful opportunities to contribute. So people should not be marginalized at a certain age and set off, that people ought to be able to participate in society throughout lifespan. So we lead with the value of justice. because people don't know what ageism is, it's important in this story as part of the explanation to actually define ageism. So ageism is discrimination, in this case against older people due to negative stereotypes, and talking about the impact that ageism has. There are a lot of recent studies and statistics, and I'm actually going to share links of those in what we send out after you. Dr. Becca Levy of the Yale School of Public Health recently completed a study that showed, for example, the annual healthcare cost of ageism, separated from all the other underlying health ailments, $63 billion. So incredible amounts of money that are taking away from other uses. So we want to talk about ageism. And because most people don't understand what ageism is, talking about workplace discrimination as an example, Frameworks found was really useful. Unfortunately, we have a lot of examples that we can use. The recent Urban Institute study showed that a huge sample of people starting in 1992 who entered their 50s with stable employment, meaning that they had worked in a job at least 5 years, with a stable employer, they had worked full-time. 56% of them had been pushed out or laid off in an employer-initiated involuntary separation. So probably one of the most robust studies about workplace discrimination and age. And, really a wake-up call for everyone. It's important as well to explain implicit bias, because Frameworks research also found that talking about implicit bias actually checks it in some people. So talking about the fact that many of us form subconscious negative judgments about people based on their age, starting with very young children. So we know that implicit bias against older people starts when children are very young. But we also know that knowing about these biases makes us less likely to act on it. We know that when, for example, HR managers and workforces are trained on implicit bias, it actually makes them less biased in interviewing and hiring processes. So important to explain that as well. And then finally, when we talk about solutions, talking about public policies that address systems and generate collective benefits. So better workplace practices, implicit bias training. One of the things we are trying to encourage at Changing the Narrative is encouraging employers to take high school graduation dates off online applications, for example. So that's how the confronting injustice narrative comes together. So we are going to pause a moment for questions. I'll give you about 30 seconds to type them in the chat box, and Betsy, you can then queue those up.
Well, I can cue them up now. This is a terrific group, and you've missed a lot of outstanding commentary. So here we go, some highlights. One is Jeanette Liardi, who is with us, who is certainly a thought leader and communicator about aging, uses the term silver reservoir, which I think is very elegant. Yeah. Norman Reese shared a link to a blog post on age-friendly employers that we can share with the group. There were some comments around someone is going to start community conversations, a reference to an Archie Bunker episode, which basically Archie saying old people only like to hang around with other old people. And this commenter saying some things haven't changed at all in the many years since Archie Bunker. So those were some of the highlights. Let me see what else has come in. Jim McGinley in Seattle has an exciting comment. He's working with Boeing, the aircraft manufacturer, who recognize that they have generations working side by side and have established a business resource group to capitalize on their collective knowledge and innovation. So that's
and Jim, I would love to know more about that. Betsy, if you can kind of share those and connect me with Jim.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. Clint Wilkins of Resilient Aging Lab is asking a question. It seems that embracing dynamic narrative would be more effective than confronting injustice narrative. Is that true? Has frameworks addressed this?
No, so all of it depends on use and what you're talking to, and who you're talking to. So it's like any other communication strategy, understanding your audience. So for example, we are using the Embracing the Dynamic when we are going out to workplaces and encouraging them to think about how they can make their businesses more age-friendly, accommodate and leverage the benefits of multiple generations. Embracing the Dynamic is really effective. When arguing for some public policy kind of solutions to ageism, confronting injustice. So again, understanding your audience is really important. And again, this is a brief kind of highlight overview of a 3.5 hour and a day-long workshop. So I'll be sharing some additional resources for those of you who want to dive deeper. But the two stories, what's important to say is both of these stories tested well in shifting public opinion. But again, when you would use them is very much understanding your audience and who and what you're trying to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. Janine, a couple other comments. Rosemary Nixon, who leads Encore Palm Beach County, is doing a survey with employers to get information on what they feel mature workers need in terms of skills updating. And Encore Palm Beach will be doing an event to recognize age-friendly employers. That's certainly a best practice in a number of places, so congratulations. Some other, and then Helen Hirsch Spence, who works in Ontario province in Canada, is putting together a program that works with multi-generational workforces. So as you've said, you are talking to people who can take the insights you're sharing and really put them into action.
Okay, terrific, fantastic. So there are two more things that I want to share before we conclude, and we'll do, if we have the ability, a final round of questions. Part of it, and what Frameworks found, is so we know what we want to advance and what's effective. There are some communications traps that it's really important to avoid. And we call them traps because they kind of drag people back to that kind of swamp. And I'm going to walk through them quickly. Super senior. So one of the things that some of the national aging organizations had done is highlight stories of people that we're creating these super feats. So someone, if I use a Colorado example, someone who's in their 80s and they're still hiking for teeners, and when they're not doing that, they're starting an Encore network program, and when they're not doing that, they are fostering 10 cats, right? They're doing all of this kind of super stuff. What the research shows that super senior triggers individualism, and and one of two things happens. For people who are themselves older, they say, that's not me, and they become discouraged. For the general public, what happens is people then start triggering individualism and saying, well, if those people can do it, we don't need to provide any public policy changes or public investment around older adults or change any public policies. Obviously, people are doing really well. So one of the things that we want to avoid in our own communication are, quote, super senior stories. We want to avoid sympathetic senior. So for those of you who are with traditional aging organizations, maybe less so Encore organizations, but within traditional aging organizations, there has typically been a history and a tradition of doing kind of sad senior. So, Emma is out on the sidewalk with her belongings because the greedy developer bought her building and turned it into, kind of high-end condos or that kind of thing. Sympathetic senior stories also trigger individualism. They don't help people understand broader issues about what kind of, for example, housing do we need to accommodate people of all ages in our communities. And they trigger a lot of negative thinking and individualistic thinking. They also trigger that thinking that nothing can be done. So that's something else we want to avoid. We want to avoid all the demographic disaster stories. So whether it's silver tsunami, going off a demographic cliff, the gray wave, all of those that suggest that the aging of America is anything different than the aging of the world. We have a fundamental demographic shift going on in the world. It is not a demographic disaster. It is not something that is unanticipated. We've known about this happening for a really long time. And what is required is for us to use that spirit of innovation and think about how we do things differently. So again, very, very similar to what Encore has been advancing for over 2 decades. We want to avoid talking about ageism as civil rights. We want to use the confronting injustice metaphor again. We want to avoid this zero-sum thinking, the us versus them. So somehow, if we fund an Encore program in a community, we are taking money away from something else. We need to move away from zero-sum and think more broadly about how do we apply our spirit of innovation. And finally, we never ever want to tell a story without a solution, because generally the public is fatalistic about how to approach this fundamental demographic and aging. We always want to conclude with solutions that are very concrete, that people can understand. So not just to say, let's do something or let's do more, but let's have an Encore program that trains older adults. And I'm going to give an example in Colorado that we were actually discussing at a group of thought leaders in Colorado yesterday. Our new governor wants to do full-day kindergarten. And everybody is talking about, okay, so exactly where are we going to get the workforce for full-day kindergarten? Because we're struggling right now with early childhood workforce as well. So a conversation about what is the role that older adults can play, not only, and for those of us who don't necessarily want to be in a classroom with young children, ramping up full-day kindergarten is going to require some business expertise and savvy. It's going to require some logistics. What are different roles that older adults can take on? So always having some sort of solution when we talk about a problem. There are words that Frameworks Institute recommendations are to avoid, and I'll go through them quickly, and again, happy to answer any questions about them. Frameworks did a test about the terms senior, elderly, and senior citizen, and found that in general, in the US, people view those terms as being associated with incompetence, lack of willingness to continue learning, lack of willingness to learn new things, lack of productivity, etc. So the recommendations are instead to use the term older adult and older person. We want to avoid the term silver tsunami and all the demographic disaster terms, and instead simply assert what is factually correct. We are all living longer and, for the most part, healthier lives. We want to avoid the language of they and them and use us and we. The reality is that all of us on this webinar, regardless of our age, regardless of anything else in our lives, have one thing in common, and it is this: for each of us today is the oldest we've ever been. And I want everybody to think about this before you go to sleep tonight. Just say, wow, it's the youngest I will ever be, right? We are all aging, and if we are fortunate, we will wake up tomorrow morning having aged yet another day. And again, using the term ageism without explanation, because there is such a lack of understanding about ageism, whenever we use that term, we need to go ahead and explain it. So I will take another round of questions. You have got in front of you different ways that you can reach me. My email, Changing the Narrative Colorado is our website. This is our Facebook page at Change Narrative CO. And we'll take a final round of questions.
Janine, I'll start with a couple of comments on the subject of ageism. Two of our participants have reminded us that Ashton Applewhite has a new edition of her book, This Chair Rocks, a manifesto against ageism, coming out in April. She is speaking in an amazing number of places, so you can hear her in person. She was the instigator of a collection of anti-ageism resources called Old School at oldschool.info. So we'll make sure people have that information handy as well.
And I'm really excited. We are hosting her in Denver. I'm actually doing an event for her on March 9th. And Changing the Narrative in collaboration with Denver Public Library is doing kind of a book reading and a book talk with her. We have about 5 or 6 events with Ashton in Denver, March 9th. We're very excited.
Great. I am not seeing any additional questions, but we'll give people, okay, here we go. Joanne Webb, who leads career services in the Western region of the Actors Fund.
Yeah, Joanne, hi, I remember you from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Joanne asked, how important have you found it to be, she's asked about creating healthy communities among adults over 50. And the Actors Fund facilitates a Nifty 50 and over group for those in the entertainment industry.
Yeah, so interesting. So I think there are all kind of, I am not a program person. I am working literally on narrative change, so working on media, social media, doing workshops like this. In the course of doing that, meeting tons of amazing people who have incredible programmatic solutions. And what I am encouraging all of them to think about, how do these messages help increase awareness of not only of your programs, but have everybody kind of talking in a consistent way about the contributions that older adults can bring. So seeing a lot of people who, I mean, we know that certainly social isolation can be an issue. And again, this is to me a really good example of where it's not us versus them. I think all the recent studies show that social isolation is true among older people and it is also true among younger people. So how do we more broadly think about bringing people together, right? And use the move away from us versus them and more, how do we bring all of us together? So, you know, certainly in favor of any kind of programs that are doing something like that.
Janine, there are two other questions, and I hope you can address each of them at least briefly. Several people would like you to go back to the topic of why ageism as a civil right, why that narrative is counterproductive. And I want to tee up the second, just so you know what both of those are about. Emily Merritt with the Alliance.
Hi, Emily.
Who's running a big Second Acts program, is reflecting on the word senior and asking what kinds of responses you're getting from traditional senior service providers. Right. Are they struggling to not only change languages, but also their service models?
Yeah. So two great questions, and I wish we had another hour because these are both big questions. I'm going to give the short answer, and again, you know, I want anyone to feel free to reach out to me, which is why I provided my contact info. Ageism is a civil right. So basically what happened, and it was kind of a strategy because we know certainly kind of in the disability community, that was kind of a strong message. When tested, it did two things. It led people to think very narrowly of legal remedies and litigation and that kind of thing, as opposed to thinking more broadly, we have a fundamental demographic shift, and this is not about the civil rights of individuals. This is about, very broadly, we need public policy changes in order to accommodate this fundamental demographic shift and make the most of the opportunity. So that was part one. Part two was there was a really strong backlash among people who had experienced racism themselves, who had experienced sexism themselves, who thought can't possibly be as bad. And if it's not as bad, maybe these, and I'm saying this in quotes, maybe these old people are making it up. So that's the sort of glib answer, but there's a lot more behind it. And I will share some of the frameworks or reports on that. Emily, this has been a really interesting, the topic of seniors. So what we have found is there are some people who have balked, and here's what we encourage and what frameworks encourages. If the word senior is in your organization name, do not change the organization name simply because of this recommendation. Having said that, a number of people are changing programmatic names, so I think it was even something in the Encore newsletter. Or someone else send this to me, but the Boston Center for the Elderly has changed to Age Strong Boston, right? People are recognizing that a better term is used. So overwhelmingly, and we actually have some data on this now that our evaluators are looking at, people are understanding that in their public communications, if my name is Senior Resource Center, I may continue using Senior Resource Center until my board, etc., decides that there are other reasons to change our names. But in our public communications, when we describe who we serve, we are going to use more inclusive language like older adult and older people, or we will be very age specific. This program serves people age 50 plus, etc.
Thank you, Janine. And so I will use my privilege to do two things. One, for those who need to break, to thank Janine for bringing extraordinary experience with the frameworks material and also her real-world expertise. Every day, Janine is out in one dimension or another of Colorado and the public and government and agencies. So this has been a real privilege, and I thank you very much, Janine. For those who are interested, I do want to do a follow-up to Emily's question. So Emily clarified that her question was more focused on, for those social service agencies whose mission is serving the frail elderly and people who need social services and supports, how are they responding to the frames? So again, for those who want to say goodbye, we'll be in touch with the recording, with the presentation, and with follow-up materials. And feel free to stay on for another minute while Janine addresses this important last subject.
Right. So Emily, thank you for asking that question. So there are two things. When we do the longer workshops, Frameworks did a parallel set of studies, one on framing elder abuse and one on framing social services writ large, not specifically geared at older adults, but at anyone who requires additional supports for whatever reason. So we touch on both of those in our longer workshops. In the resources that I'll be sending you, there are links specifically to the reframing work on framing for more vulnerable older adults. And they're both to the social services metaphors and they're to the reframing elder abuse. The things that are in common are this: don't lead with compassion and pity and that kind of thing. Lead with recognizing that, if you will, older adults are people too, and we want to avoid otherizing them. That's kind of part one. Part two that we talk about is both of these frames have been and can be used successfully to advocate for the kind of policies that prevent later life frailty. So by having more age-friendly communities, we're using them throughout Colorado, because Colorado is, I think, the third state to declare age-friendly state after Massachusetts and New York. And we're using them to advocate across the state for age-friendly policies, whether it's in the built environment, so that whether it's for transportation, so the kind of things that can keep people active in community longer. So the frames that you've learned about today, the two social issue narratives, are good for advocating for prevention, if you will, for people who are actually currently working with and serving older adults who are more frail and vulnerable, using some frames that have been done in other Frameworks Institute studies are useful, and you'll get the links to those.
Great. Thank you again, Janine. You're certainly hearing that if there are questions that relate to your work, Janine will be excited to hear from you and to continue the conversation. So again, Janine, thanks for a terrific webinar. And this has been, I would say, the most engaged audience I've ever seen on an Encore webinar.
Yay.
So congratulations, thanks for coming, and let's keep making the world better together.
You bet. Thank you all. Frame on.